First tonight, a jury has found a prisoner in Victoria's highest security jail guilty of murdering gangland boss Carl Williams.
Williams' former cellmate, Matthew Johnson, is standing trial for his murder.
In the world of Melbourne's crime scene, Matthew Johnson's name stands out for all the wrong reasons. Known as one of the most notorious prison hitmen, his story is as shocking as it is chilling. But how did a guy who started out as a petty criminal end up carrying out a murder so brutal it left everyone in shock? And what drove him to kill one of Australia's most infamous criminals, Carl Williams, behind bars? Today we're diving into the dark rise and fall of Matthew Johnson, the man who went from small-time crook to notorious hitman. Matthew Johnson's story starts, like so many others, in the gritty streets of Melbourne. Born in 1983, he grew up in a neighborhood where crime was just part of life. His early years weren't exactly a dream. His family wasn't well off, and trouble was never far behind. It wasn't long before Johnson started getting himself into the wrong crowd. At first, it wasn't anything too wild, small-time stuff like stealing cars and petty break-ins. But as the years went on, things took a darker turn. By the time he was a teenager, Matthew wasn't just a typical street kid anymore. He was diving headfirst into the criminal underworld. Melbourne was buzzing with drug deals, gang activity, and all kinds of dodgy business, and Johnson was right in the thick of it. But while other young criminals were just looking to make a quick buck, Johnson had bigger ambitions. He didn't just want to be another guy who dealt a bit of gear on the side. He wanted to make a real name for himself. His first major brush with the law came in the early 2000s when he was caught up in a robbery that went horribly wrong. This wasn't the first time Johnson had been arrested, but it was the moment when he realized something. There was a darker side to his nature, one that was much more suited to the brutal world of violence than the petty theft. Around this time, Johnson met some heavy hitters in the Melbourne crime scene. These weren't your average criminals. These were the big players in Melbourne's notorious gangland war. The likes of Carl Williams, a man who was practically a household name in the underworld, were no strangers to Johnson. Williams was a key figure in Melbourne's drug trade, and his name carried weight. When Johnson found himself in the orbit of men like Williams, he quickly realized the game was much bigger than anything he had imagined. But Johnson wasn't just looking to hang around and be a small-time operator. He wanted more. And as he became more deeply involved in Melbourne's criminal underworld, Johnson started to carve out a role for himself that was far darker than anything he'd done before. By the mid-2000s, he was being trusted with some pretty heavy tasks that included violence, intimidation, and ultimately murder. It's hard to say exactly what pushed Johnson into this deadly territory, but the money, the power, and the sense of fear he could inspire in others seemed to fuel his ambitions. At this point, Johnson was no longer just a petty criminal. He was becoming a professional hitman. And the thing about hitmen is that they're often the most dangerous kind of criminal. They don't just rob or steal, they kill. And Johnson wasn't the kind of guy who hesitated when it came to that part of the job. This chapter of his life wasn't marked by any single event. No, it was more of a slow and steady progression into a lifestyle where murder was part of the business. By the time he caught the attention of people like Carl Williams, it was clear that Matthew Johnson was no longer a small-time player. He was an up-and-comer, someone to watch. But here's where things take a wild turn. At the same time, Johnson was rising through the ranks of Melbourne's criminal world. The city's gangland war was heating up. Rival factions were clashing, and no one was safe. Men like Carl Williams were at the center of the storm, with enemies on every side. Johnson, having proved his ruthlessness, found himself in the perfect position to be hired as a hitman. But who exactly would he target? And what would it mean for the bigger players involved in this bloody game? By the time Matthew Johnson's name started to spread in the criminal world, he had already made a reputation for himself as someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. In fact, he was becoming known for his brutal approach to business, something that didn't go unnoticed by the power players of Melbourne's underworld. With the city's gangland war intensifying, violent acts became a common currency in settling scores. But Johnson wasn't just some random enforcer. He had quickly proven that he was cold, calculated, and efficient. His skill set wasn't just about pulling a trigger. He had a knack for being in the right place at the right time. Now, let's talk about Carl Williams. If you've heard of him, you'll know he wasn't just another drug dealer. He was the boss of one of the most powerful crime syndicates in Melbourne. Williams' rise to power was explosive, and his name was often associated with both wealth and violence. But as with all big players in the game, there were rivals who didn't like the way he ran things. Johnson was drawn into this world when Williams became aware of his growing reputation. It was around this time that Johnson's life took a crucial turn. He wasn't just doing odd jobs anymore, he was now being trusted with high-profile hits. People like Williams, who were sitting at the top of Melbourne's criminal food chain, needed someone who could get the job done without asking too many questions. While many criminals might hesitate before taking on a job as dangerous as this, Johnson didn't think twice. After all, working for someone like Williams wasn't just about making a quick buck. It was about power, status, and respect. For someone like Johnson, that kind of reputation was the ultimate prize. But there was a catch. As ruthless as Johnson was, he was playing a dangerous game. Williams had made plenty of enemies over the years, and anyone connected to him was a target. Yet, Johnson's role as a hitman was just getting started, and the first high-profile target on his radar would be none other than Carl Williams himself. The story of how Johnson ended up behind bars is tied directly to his involvement with Williams. The two crossed paths in a way that seemed almost inevitable. Williams, caught up in a violent feud with his own enemies, found himself incarcerated at Barwon Prison in 2010. Little did he know, this would become the setting for the shocking turn of events that would forever link his fate to Matthew Johnson's. In prison, things are never straightforward. The usual rules of the street don't apply, and deals are made, broken, and sometimes sealed with blood. Carl Williams, a man known for his power on the outside, was now just another inmate in a facility filled with dangerous men. But Williams had a lot of enemies, and some of them were lurking just beyond his cell. Matthew Johnson was one of those men, but not because of any personal beef. His role was simple. He was hired to do the job. The hit was on. At the time, Johnson was just one of many inmates at Barwon, but the timing was critical. The plan was set into motion, and soon enough, Williams, who had been in prison for several years, was brutally murdered. On April 19, 2010, Carl Williams was killed in what seemed like a calculated attack that shocked the nation. And who was behind it? None other than Matthew Johnson. The murder itself wasn't as spontaneous as it appeared. Johnson, as cool-headed and methodical as ever, executed the hit with military precision. The media coverage of Williams' murder only made Johnson's name more infamous. For someone who had been working in the shadows, this was the moment that would put him on the map. He was no longer just a hired gun. He was Melbourne's most notorious prison hitman. But while the public focused on the shock of the murder, there were bigger questions that began to swirl. Was this hit simply a professional job, or was there more to the story? Johnson's reasons for taking down someone like Williams weren't fully clear. And as the investigation into the murder began to unfold, a tangled web of motives, rivalries, and betrayals started to reveal itself. Was Johnson working for someone else, or was this a power play of his own? This was just the beginning of Matthew Johnson's journey into notoriety. The next chapter would reveal how his rise to fame as a prison hitman would ultimately lead to his downfall. On April 19, 2010, the world of Australian crime was rocked by the brutal murder of Carl Williams, a notorious gangster who had once been at the top of Melbourne's criminal underworld. It was a murder that sent shockwaves not only through the prison system, but across the country. The man behind the murder? Matthew Johnson. Up until that point, Johnson had been known in the criminal world, but this cold-blooded act would turn him into a household name. The murder of Carl Williams wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a calculated execution, planned and carried out with chilling precision. At the time, Williams was serving a life sentence for a string of murders, and it seemed like his reign over Melbourne's criminal empire was over. But in the world of crime, things aren't always as they seem. After the murder, the investigation into Williams' death was swift. At first, it seemed like just another prison killing, something that happens regularly in the world of crime. But as the details started to emerge, it became clear that this was no ordinary murder. Johnson had not only killed a man who had once been at the top of Melbourne's underworld, but he had also sent a message to everyone in the criminal world. He was no longer just a small-time player. He was now a force to be reckoned with. The media coverage of the murder was intense, and Johnson's role in the crime quickly became a topic of fascination. He wasn't just another inmate in Barwon Prison. He was the guy who had taken down Carl Williams, one of the most infamous gangsters in Australia's history. The murder turned him into a legend in the underworld, but it also marked the beginning of his downfall. While the hit made Johnson famous, it didn't exactly guarantee a smooth ride ahead. In fact, it set in motion a series of events that would eventually lead to his arrest, conviction, and imprisonment. The murder of Carl Williams was just one chapter in the story of Matthew Johnson, but it was a pivotal one. It marked the moment when Johnson went from being a prison enforcer to a notorious hitman with a target on his back. The aftermath of Williams' murder was chaos. Investigators were left scrambling to piece together the details, and Johnson's name was soon linked to the crime. But Johnson wasn't finished yet. The fallout from this high-profile murder would eventually catch up with him, leading to his trial and conviction. Still, the brutal way in which Williams was killed only made Johnson's reputation stronger. The question on everyone's mind was, would this be the end of the line for Matthew Johnson? Or was this just the beginning of an even darker chapter? As the trial unfolded, the public became even more intrigued by the man who had killed Carl Williams. Was he a cold-blooded killer who had done it for money and power? Or was there something more to his actions? The more people dug into his past, the more it became clear that Johnson was no stranger to violence. But there was still one question that loomed large. How far would he go to protect his position in the criminal world? The answer would come soon enough, and it would be as shocking as the murder itself. Matthew Johnson's life after the murder of Carl Williams was a roller coaster of legal battles, public scrutiny, and a slow, painful descent into the reality of his actions. When he killed Williams, he thought he was sealing his place as one of Melbourne's most feared hitmen. But in the world of crime, things rarely go according to plan. While the murder made him infamous, it didn't shield him from the consequences. In fact, it might have made them come faster than he expected. After Williams' murder, Johnson didn't exactly have the luxury of lying low. His name was all over the media, and soon enough, the authorities were connecting the dots. The brutal nature of the killing made it hard for anyone to ignore the fact that Johnson was a prime suspect. Soon, he was behind bars, facing a long list of charges. Despite the pressure mounting against him, Johnson never showed much remorse. In fact, he remained defiant throughout the legal proceedings, even as the evidence stacked up against him. He wasn't just a hitman anymore. He was a symbol of how far one could go in the twisted underworld of Melbourne. His trial was a public spectacle. The media couldn't get enough of the details, and Johnson became the subject of countless headlines. Was he a cold-blooded killer, or was he simply a product of the brutal world he'd been born into? The public debate raged on, but the truth was clear. Johnson was responsible for Carl Williams' murder. The trial was intense, and the verdict was even more so. He was found guilty, and Matthew Johnson's once promising rise in the criminal world came crashing down. However, Johnson's downfall wasn't just about the murder of Williams. It was about everything that came with it. The fact that the hit wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of an even deeper spiral into violence and chaos.